He left you the cabin, Jack. The land, the timber, everything up to the creek line. But Silas was very specific about the terms. Terms? I haven't seen the man in 40 years, Mr. Henderson. What terms? You can sell the furniture. You can tear down the roof. You can burn the walls to the ground if you like. But there is one rule. You must never, under any circumstances, remove a single board from the floor. The floor? If you pry up one nail from that floor, the inheritance is void. Do you understand? Why would a man forbid his only nephew from fixing a rotting floor? What is Uncle Silas hiding in the frozen wilderness of Alaska? If you want to uncover the mystery alongside Jack and Gunnar, please press that follow button right now. You won't want to miss what lies beneath the floorboards. Jack Sullivan didn't come to the lawyer's office that day looking for a fortune. He came because he had nowhere else to go. It was a typical Detroit winter day, gray, miserable, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones and refuses to leave. Earlier that morning, Jack sat in a diner booth with taped-up vinyl seats, counting out crumpled dollar bills and loose change onto the table. He had exactly $4.50 to his name. "Coffee's on the house today, Jack," the waitress had said softly. "Thanks, Barb." He ordered a single plain burger, no fries. When it arrived, he didn't eat it all. He took a napkin, wrapped half the steaming burger, and slid it carefully into his pocket. He ate the other half slowly, savoring every bite. Jack was a retired Marine, a widower, a man who gave his youth to his country and his remaining strength to the assembly line, only to find himself alone when the factories closed and his knees gave out. He walked out to the parking lot where his old rusted Ford truck waited. He opened the passenger door to reveal Gunnar, an old Belgian Malinois wrapped in a moth-eaten wool blanket. Jack unwrapped the napkin and gave the entire saved half of the burger to the dog. "Eat up, buddy, it's the good stuff today." Gunnar took the food gently, then licked Jack's rough hand. Jack rested his forehead against the dog's head for a moment. "They say you can't buy loyalty." Jack knew that was true. He and Gunnar were two old soldiers fighting a war against a world that had forgotten them. Back in the warmth of the office, the lawyer pushed a thick envelope across the mahogany desk. "Silas knew you were struggling, Jack. He kept tabs on you. He knew about Mary passing. He knew about the foreclosure. If he knew, why didn't he call? Why wait until he was dead? Because Silas was ashamed. He went north to find gold during the last echoes of the rush. He spent 50 years digging in the dirt. Everyone called him Crazy Silas. But he wrote you a letter. He said I was only allowed to give it to you once you accepted the key." The lawyer reached into a drawer and pulled out a key. It wasn't normal. It was made of black iron, oversized, ugly, and ancient. He dropped it onto the desk, and it made a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil, a heavy, dull thud. Jack reached out. His rough hand closed around the cold iron. He frowned, trying to lift it. His arm dipped slightly under the unexpected weight. "What is this made of? It weighs 5 pounds. "Silas melted it down himself," the lawyer replied, watching Jack closely. He said, "Heavy keys open heavy doors, Jack, and heavy doors protect heavy burdens." Jack opened the letter. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, frantic. "Don't sell the land, Jack. Don't let the city men with their shiny suits take it. I built a sanctuary. It's cold and it's lonely, but it's safe. Just promise me one thing. Respect the floor. Walk lightly." There was nothing keeping him in Detroit anymore. The eviction notice was already taped to his apartment door. The VA check barely covered gas, let alone rent. Jack lifted Gunnar into the passenger seat of the truck. The dog settled in, looking at Jack with absolute trust. "Well, Gunnar, you like snow?" Gunnar gave a short, sharp bark. "Good, because we're going to where the snow never ends." The truck engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. It sounded tired but reliable. Jack shifted into gear. The heavy iron key sat on the dashboard, vibrating with the engine. It looked ominous against the fading city lights. Jack thought he was inheriting a cabin. He thought he was inheriting a place to die in peace. He didn't know he was driving straight into a mystery that had been buried for half a century. And he certainly didn't know why the floorboards of his new home were forbidden territory. The drive from Detroit to the edge of the Arctic Circle is not merely a journey. It is an endurance test. It is a shedding of skin, mile by agonizing mile. Jack watched the world change through the cracked windshield of his Ford F-150. The gray slush of the Rust Belt gave way to the flat, endless cornfields of the Midwest, then the jagged rise of the Rockies, and finally the towering, silent majesty of the Yukon. By the time they crossed the border into Alaska, the truck was groaning in protest. The heater rattled, fighting a losing battle against a cold that pressed against the glass like a physical weight. Jack's knees, ruined by years of jumping out of transport trucks and standing on concrete factory floors, throbbed with a dull, relentless rhythm. Beside him, Gunnar slept. The old Malinois was the only creature Jack knew who could sleep through the apocalypse. But every time the truck hit a frost heave in the road, the dog's eyes would snap open, scanning the horizon with that intensity only a working dog possesses, before settling back down with a heavy sigh. "Almost there, buddy," Jack whispered, his voice raspy from days of silence. "Almost home." The directions the lawyer had given him were sketched on a yellow legal pad, referencing landmarks that barely existed anymore. Turn left at the burnt pine, follow the creek bed past the old surveyor's marker. It took them 6 hours to find the turnoff for North Point. It wasn't a road. It was a scar in the forest, overgrown with brush and buried under 2 feet of fresh powder. Jack shifted the truck into 4 low, the gears grinding in protest, and forced the vehicle up the incline. The tires spun, biting into the ice, pushing forward through sheer mechanical stubbornness. And then the trees broke. There it sat, the legacy of Silas Sullivan. It was not the sprawling log mansion Jack had secretly pictured in his weaker moments. It was a box, a squat, rectangular structure sitting alone in a clearing, flanked by a frozen lake on one side and a sheer granite cliff on the other. It looked less like a home and more like a bunker disguised as a cabin. There were no charming porches, no decorative eaves, just heavy, dark timber that looked petrified by the cold. Jack killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. In the city, silence is just a pause between noises. In Alaska, silence is a presence. It watches you. "Well," Jack grunted, opening the door. The cold hit him instantly, 30 below zero, sharp enough to freeze the moisture in his nose. "It's got a roof, Gunnar. That's more than we had yesterday." Gunnar hopped out, his paws sinking into the snow. He didn't run to mark territory. He didn't roll in the drift. He stood rigid, his nose lifted to the wind, sniffing the air with a low, vibrating growl in his throat. He wasn't acting like a pet. He was acting like he was back on patrol. Jack grabbed his duffel bag and the heavy iron key. The snow crunched loudly under his boots as he approached the front door. It was made of rough-hewn oak, reinforced with iron straps that had rusted to the color of dried blood. He slid the heavy key into the lock. It fit with a satisfying, oily precision that felt out of place in such a rough structure. Click. The mechanism tumbled smoothly. Jack gripped the handle and shoved. The door didn't budge. He frowned, braced his shoulder against the wood, and pushed with his full weight. With a groan of metal on metal, the door swung inward. It was unnervingly heavy. A door that size should weigh 50 pounds. This one felt like it weighed 300. "Silas," Jack muttered, rubbing his sore shoulder. "What were you trying to keep out?" They stepped inside. The interior was freezing, perhaps even colder than the outside because the air was stale, trapped in time. The late afternoon sun cut through the grime of the single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness. The cabin was sparse. A cast-iron wood stove sat in the corner, cold and black. A simple wooden table with one chair. A narrow cot frame without a mattress pushed against the far wall. It was the home of a monk, or a man who had forgotten how to be human. Jack took a step forward, and that was when he noticed it. Thud. He took another step. Thud. He stopped. He looked down at his boots, then at the floorboards. They were wide planks of rough pine, gray with age. In any other cabin, stepping on a floor like this would produce a symphony of creaks, groans, and squeaks. Wood warps, wood breathes, wood complains when you walk on it. But this floor was dead silent. Jack stomped his heel down hard. Thud! The sound was flat, solid. It didn't echo. It sounded like striking a concrete slab wrapped in a blanket. It felt incredibly, impossibly dense. "Walk lightly," Jack whispered, repeating the warning from the letter. "Don't pry up the nails." He looked around the small room with new eyes. The walls were thick, almost 2 feet thick, judging by the depth of the window frame. The draft he expected to feel was non-existent. The place was sealed tight as a drum. Gunnar was pacing now. The dog's nails clicked against the strange, silent wood. He wasn't settling. He walked in tight circles in the center of the room, his nose pressed almost flat against the cracks between the planks. He let out a whine, high-pitched and anxious. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Mice? Rats?" Gunnar looked up at Jack, then looked back down at the floor, pawing tentatively at a specific board near the wood stove. He didn't dig aggressively. He just tapped it, as if testing it. Jack felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. He knelt down beside the dog. He ran his hand over the floorboards. They were freezing cold to the touch, colder than the wooden table. Wood is an insulator. It holds a little warmth. This floor sucked the heat right out of his fingertips. "It feels like stone," Jack murmured. But they couldn't eat mysteries, and they couldn't keep warm with questions. The sun was dipping behind the granite cliff, and the temperature was plummeting. Survival came first. Curiosity could wait. "Work to do, Gunnar," Jack said, standing up, his joints popping. For the next hour, the old Marine went into autopilot. He found a stack of seasoned birch logs covered by a tarp outside. He hauled them in, the physical labor warming his blood. He primed the stove, his hands moving with the muscle memory of a man who had spent half his life in the field. When the fire finally caught, roaring to life behind the iron grate, the smell of burning birch filled the room. It was a sweet, wild scent that chased away the stale odor of abandonment. Jack laid out his sleeping bag on the cot. He poured some dry kibble into a travel bowl for Gunnar, then opened a can of beans for himself, heating it directly on top of the stove. Night fell heavy and absolute. There were no streetlights here, no ambient glow from a city, just a darkness so complete it felt like being underwater. They ate in silence, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows against the thick walls. Jack felt the exhaustion finally catch up to him, a tidal wave of fatigue crashing over his adrenaline. He sat on the edge of the cot, sipping water from a tin cup. Gunnar finished his food and walked over to the center of the room again. The dog circled 3 times, then collapsed with a heavy huff. Not on the blanket Jack had laid out for him near the fire, but right there, in the middle of the floor. Gunnar rested his chin on his paws, his eyes open, watching the door. "You're on guard duty, huh?" Jack asked softly. He looked at the heavy iron key sitting on the table. He looked at the floor that didn't creak. He thought about the uncle he barely knew, a man called Crazy Silas, who lived in a box that felt like a bank vault. Jack lay back, pulling the sleeping bag up to his chin. The cabin was warming up, but the floor beneath them remained stubbornly, unnaturally cold. "We're safe here, Gunnar," Jack lied to the darkness. "It's just a house, just a heavy old house." But as he drifted off to sleep, Jack could have sworn he heard a sound. Not from outside, not from the wind howling through the pines. It was a sound from beneath him, a low, metallic, settling sound, like the earth itself was shifting under the weight of the floorboards. Jack closed his eyes, his hand dropping down to rest on Gunnar's flank. He didn't know it yet, but he wasn't sleeping in a cabin. He was sleeping on top of the answer to a question he hadn't dared to ask. Morning broke over the Alaska range, not with a burst of sunlight, but with a slow, bruised purple that bled into the gray of the sky. Inside the cabin, the cold was a physical weight. It sat on Jack's chest, heavy and insistent, waking him before his eyes even opened. He lay still for a moment on the narrow cot, his breath pluming in the air like dragon smoke. His joints felt like rusted hinges, the legacy of too many jumps out of transport planes and too many winters in Detroit. "Up and at 'em, Gunnar," Jack groaned, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. The Malinois was already awake. In fact, Gunnar hadn't moved from his spot in the center of the room. He sat on his haunches, watching Jack with alert, amber eyes. The dog looked stiff, too. The floorboards beneath him must have been like sleeping on a sheet of ice, yet he refused to leave his post. Jack's first order of business was survival. He stoked the dying embers in the cast-iron stove, feeding it split birch until the fire roared back to life. He found an old dented percolator in a cupboard and filled it with snow he scooped from the doorstep. Soon the smell of coffee filled the small room. It was the universal scent of morning in America, whether you were in a Manhattan penthouse or a shack at the end of the world. Jack wrapped his hands around the tin mug, letting the heat seep into his calloused palms. He took a sip. It was bitter, black, and strong enough to strip paint, just the way he liked it. With the fire crackling and the caffeine hitting his bloodstream, Jack finally took a good look at his inheritance in the daylight. The cabin was aggressively simple. It was built for utility, not comfort. But as Jack moved around, running his hand along the rough-hewn shelves, he began to see the ghosts of the man who lived here. Uncle Silas wasn't just a crazy hermit, he was a man of order. The canned goods were stacked with military precision, labels facing forward. The few tools hanging on the wall, an axe, a hammer, a saw, were oiled and free of rust. This was the home of a man who maintained his gear because he knew his life depended on it. It was a language Jack understood perfectly. On the mantelpiece, hidden behind a jar of rusty nails, Jack found a small wooden cigar box. He dusted it off and opened the lid. Inside, there were no jewels, no deeds, no money. Just the debris of a lonely life. A Zippo lighter with the distinct emblem of the 1st Cavalry Division. A pocket knife, and a photograph. Jack picked up the photo. It was black and white, curling at the edges. It showed a younger Silas, lean, wire-tough, standing next to a sluice box in a muddy creek. But Silas wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking down, smiling at a dog sitting at his feet. A German shepherd, big and dark. Jack turned the photo over. In shaky handwriting, it read, Silas and Sarge, 1974. The only two who know. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He looked down at Gunnar, who had finally moved to the fire to warm his aching hips. He was just like us, buddy, Jack whispered. He came out here to be alone, but he couldn't do it without a partner. Under the photo lay a leather-bound logbook. The leather was cracked and stained with water and oil. Jack carried it to the table, sitting down heavily. The chair scraped against the floor, but the sound was dull, swallowed by the strange density of the wood. He opened the book. He expected to find a prospector's ledger, ounces of gold found, weather reports, supply lists. Instead, he found a confession. October 12, 1988. The winter is coming early. My knees are bad today. The hauling is killing me, but I can't stop. If I stop, the thoughts come back. The noise of the jungle comes back. I have to keep building. I have to make the foundation stronger. November 4th, 1988, Sarge is slowing down. He spends all day lying on the floor spots where the heat rises. I told him we're rich, but he doesn't care. He just wants a soft place to sleep. I failed him. I have all this metal, but I can't buy him a new hip. Jack turned the pages, his eyes scanning the entries. Silas spoke of the metal, not with greed, but with a strange mixture of reverence and burden. He never called it gold. He called it the weight. July 19th, 1995. I finished the floor today. It took me 3 weeks to lay the main beams. My back is broken, but it's done. No one will ever know. They see a shack. I see a fortress. I see the Bank of Silas. Let them laugh. Let the tax man come. He can't tax what he can't see. Jack paused. He looked down at his boots. He looked at the innocent-looking pine planks beneath him. The main beams, Jack muttered. He stood up restless. He needed to fix the latch on the window, which was rattling in the wind. He grabbed the heavy iron hammer from the wall. As he turned, his grip slipped. The hammer fell from his hand. It plummeted 3 feet and struck the floor. It should have made a thud. It should have made the sound of steel hitting soft pine. Instead, the sound that rang out was a sharp, resonant clank. It was the sound of metal striking metal, a high, ringing note that vibrated through the soles of Jack's boots. Gunnar jumped up, barking sharply at the spot where the hammer had landed. Jack froze. The sound hung in the air, unnatural and revealing. He knelt down, picking up the hammer. He looked closely at the floorboard. The hammer had left a dent in the wood, but it was a shallow dent. Underneath the splintered pine fiber, there was no give. It was rock hard. Jack took his pocket knife out. His hand hovered over the floor. He remembered the lawyer's voice. If you pry up one nail, the inheritance is void. He hesitated. He didn't pry up the nail. Instead, he used the tip of the knife to scrape gently at the tiny dent the hammer had made. He scraped away a millimeter of gray wood. A faint, dull glint shone back at him. It wasn't the bright flash of jewelry. It was the dark, heavy, buttery yellow of raw, unpolished metal. Jack sat back on his heels, his heart hammering against his ribs. Uncle Silas hadn't hidden his gold under the floorboards. He hadn't buried it in the yard. Silas had forged the gold into the very structure of the house. The beams, the joists, the terrifyingly heavy foundation that kept this shack from blowing away in the Arctic wind. It wasn't wood. It was solid bullion, disguised with a veneer of pine and paint. Jack looked around the room. The heavy door, the thick walls, the fortress. My God, Jack whispered. We're living inside the treasure chest. He wasn't standing on a floor. He was standing on millions of dollars of history, pain, and sweat, melted down and hidden in plain sight. Suddenly, the cabin felt different. It didn't feel like a shelter anymore. It felt vulnerable. Gunnar let out a low growl, his ears swiveling toward the window. Jack snapped his head up. Through the grime of the glass, past the clearing, he saw something moving against the white backdrop of the frozen lake. It was a snowmobile, black and sleek, cutting a silent line toward their cabin. It wasn't a neighbor coming to say hello. The engine was cut, drifting on momentum to approach quietly. Jack grabbed the hammer tight. He looked at the floor, then at the dog. Steady, Gunner, Jack said, his voice dropping to a command tone. Company's coming. The secret of North Point had been safe for 20 years, but secrets have a way of smelling like blood to the wolves. And the wolves were at the door. The snowmobile engine cut out, leaving a ringing silence in the clearing. Through the frosted glass of the single window, Jack watched the rider dismount. The stranger moved with the stiff, awkward gait of a city man unaccustomed to deep snow. He was dressed in a high-end, neon yellow Arctic survival suit that looked brand new. The kind of gear rich tourists wore when they wanted to play explorer for a weekend in Aspen. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a face that was too tan for an Alaskan winter, with teeth that were too white and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jack stepped back from the window. He looked down at the spot on the floor where he had scraped away the wood. The dull yellow glint of the gold beam was still visible, a tiny eye staring up at him. Cover it, Jack whispered to himself. He grabbed the rag he had used to clean the stove and tossed it casually over the exposed metal. Then he picked up the heavy iron hammer. He weighed it in his hand for a moment, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what lay beneath his feet, before hanging it back on the wall loop. Gunner, heel. The command came out low and guttural. Gunner, who had been pacing with his hackles raised, the fur along his spine standing up like a razorback ridge, immediately moved to Jack's left side. The dog didn't sit. He stood rigid, his chest pressed against Jack's leg, his amber eyes fixed on the oak door. A heavy fist pounded on the wood. Bang, bang, bang. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the knock of a man who assumed he owned whatever was on the other side. Jack waited 3 seconds, a power move he'd learned in the Corps, before sliding the heavy iron bolt back. He opened the door, but he didn't step back to invite the stranger in. He filled the frame, his broad shoulders blocking the view of the interior. Help you? Jack asked. His voice was gravel, rougher than usual. The man on the porch blinked, his smile faltering for a millisecond before clicking back into place. He looked Jack up and down, taking in the faded flannel shirt, the worn work pants, and the gray stubble on Jack's chin. Mr. Sullivan, Jack, good to meet you, good to meet you. The man thrust a gloved hand forward. Elias Thorne, Thorne and Associates Realty out of Anchorage. Jack didn't take the hand. He just looked at it until Thorne awkwardly pulled it back. I didn't call a realtor, Jack said. Of course not, Thorne chuckled, as if Jack had told a clever joke. I was just in the area surveying some timber lines, and I heard Silas's nephew had finally come up. I thought I'd stop by, offer a neighborly welcome. You're a long way from Anchorage for a neighborly visit, Jack noted. Thorne's eyes darted past Jack, trying to peer into the gloom of the cabin. Gunner let out a sound that was barely audible, a low, vibrating rumble that sounded like tectonic plates grinding together. Thorne took a half step back. That's quite a dog you have there. He's retired, Jack said. Like me, he doesn't like noise. Right, Thorne cleared his throat. He reached into the pocket of his expensive snowsuit and pulled out a leather business card holder. Look, Jack, can I call you Jack? Let's cut to the chase. I know about the situation. What situation? The debt, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Old Silas. He was a character, wasn't he? But he wasn't great with paperwork. Property taxes, land usage fees, they pile up. This place, it's a liability. It's a money pit sitting in the middle of nowhere. Jack kept his face like stone. He knew the lawyer had said the taxes were paid up for 10 years. Thorne was lying. I'm a problem solver, Jack, Thorne continued, gaining confidence. He pulled a folded check from his pocket. I represent a development group. We're looking to build an eco-lodge near the lake. We need the land. The cabin, well, we'd bulldoze this old eyesore, obviously. Jack felt Gunner tense against his leg at the word bulldoze. I have a check here. Thorne said, waving the paper. $50,000. Cash. Today. You sign the deed, hand me the keys, and I'll even give you a ride back to the airport. You can be back in Detroit, sitting in a warm bar, by tomorrow night. $50,000. For a man who had eaten a half burger yesterday, it was a fortune. It was a new truck. It was a small apartment. It was an easy way out. But Jack wasn't thinking about the money. He was thinking about the floorboards. He was thinking about Uncle Silas, broken and lonely, pouring molten gold into the foundation of this house so that his legacy would be unbreakable. 50,000, Jack repeated. It's a generous offer, Thorne smiled, thinking he had won, for a shack that's probably rotting from the inside out. Honestly, the foundation is probably cracked. The floor is probably warped. We're doing you a favor. Jack looked at Thorne. He saw a vulture, a man who didn't see the beauty of the mountains or the dignity of the structure. He only saw what he could extract. You ever build a house, Mr. Thorne? Jack asked quietly. Thorne blinked. I hire contractors. My uncle built this house, Jack said. He built it with his own hands. He hauled every log. He drove every nail. Jack took a step forward, crossing the threshold onto the porch. The cold air swirled around them, but Jack didn't shiver. This isn't a liability, it's a home, and it's not for sale. Thorne's smile vanished. The friendly salesman mask dropped, revealing something cold and sharp underneath. Don't be stupid, old man, Thorne snapped. You have no idea what you're sitting on. The winter up here kills people, especially old men with no money. The pipes will freeze, the generator will fail, and when you're freezing to death in the dark, you'll wish you took my money. Gunnar stepped forward, his lips curling back to reveal teeth that were yellowed but still dangerously sharp. He didn't bark. He just stared at Thorne's throat. Get off my land, Jack said. Thorne stared at Jack, then at the dog. He realized he had pushed too far. He shoved the check back into his pocket. I'll be back, Thorne spat, backing toward his snowmobile. And the offer goes down 10,000 every time I have to drive out here. Don't come back, Jack warned. Next time I won't hold the dog. Jack stood on the porch and watched as Thorne straddled the machine, revved the engine aggressively, and tore off across the snow, leaving a cloud of blue exhaust fumes hanging in the pristine air. Jack waited until the sound of the engine faded into the distance before he turned back to the door. He stepped inside and threw the heavy iron bolt, locking it with a decisive clank. His heart was beating fast, not from fear but from adrenaline. He walked to the window and watched the tracks in the snow. Thorne hadn't looked at the roof. He hadn't looked at the view. He had kept looking at the bottom of the house. He knows, Gunnar, Jack whispered. The dog looked up, his tail giving a single slow thump against the floor. He doesn't know exactly what is here, Jack corrected himself. But he knows Silas was hiding something. He thinks it's buried underneath. Jack walked back to the center of the room. He kicked the rag aside, revealing the dull gold beam again. Thorne had called the house a rotting eyesore. He said the foundation was probably cracked. Jack knelt down and placed his hand on the cold metal. It was the strongest foundation in Alaska. It was indestructible. But Thorne was right about one thing. The winter was coming, and now so was the war. Jack looked at the fireplace. He needed more wood. He needed to secure the windows. He needed to make sure this fortress was ready for a siege. We're not going back to Detroit, Gunnar, Jack said, his voice finding a new steeliness. This is our post now, and we don't abandon our post. Gunnar licked Jack's face, sensing the shift in his master's mood. The old Marine stood up, his back straighter than it had been in years. The fatigue was gone. The pain in his knees was forgotten. Jack Sullivan had a mission again. The storm didn't arrive, it attacked. In the lower 48, people talk about storms like they are inconveniences. Bad traffic, school cancellations, a shovel needed for the driveway. In the Alaskan interior, a blizzard is a predatory animal. It hunts for weakness. By nightfall, the wind was screaming around the cabin like a banshee. Jack estimated gusts of 60, maybe 70 miles per hour. The temperature had dropped so low that the mercury in the thermometer nailed to the porch post had simply stopped registering. Inside, the cabin felt like a submarine under depth charge attack. The heavy timber walls groaned under the pressure, but, and Jack noticed this with a strange sense of awe, they didn't sway. A normal wood frame house would be shuddering. This cabin stood immovable, anchored by a weight that defied physics. It's all right, buddy, Jack murmured. He was sitting in the single wooden chair, pulled close to the stove. Gunnar wasn't happy. The old dog hated the drop in pressure. He was pacing the perimeter of the room, his nails clicking in anxious rhythm on the floorboards. Every time a particularly violent gust slammed into the north wall, Gunnar would let out a sharp bark, as if warning the wind to back off. The power, such as it was, had flickered and died an hour ago. The single bulb dangling from the ceiling was dead. Jack had lit an old kerosene lantern, and the golden dancing light threw long, nervous shadows against the logs. Jack held the photograph of Uncle Silas and his dog, Sarge, in his hands. He was using the light of the lantern to study the background of the picture. It looked like Silas was standing in a creek bed, but the equipment behind him wasn't standard panning gear. It looked industrial, smelting equipment, melting. "What did you do, Silas?" Jack whispered. "You didn't just pan for dust. You were making bricks." Suddenly, a thunderous crack echoed from the roof. It sounded like a gunshot. Jack was on his feet instantly, the combat instincts of a Marine taking over before his conscious mind could catch up. Gunnar was barking furiously at the ceiling. "Easy down," Jack commanded. He looked up. The roof held. It was likely a heavy branch from the ancient pine tree outside, sheared off by the wind and dropped onto the shingles. But the impact had shaken the house violently. And then Jack heard it, a small metallic clatter. He looked down. In the jolt, the Zippo lighter, the one with the 1st Cavalry emblem that he had been turning over in his fingers, had slipped from his hand. It had fallen, bounced once, and slid directly into a widening gap between 2 floorboards near the stove. "Damn it," Jack cursed softly. He knelt down. The gap was narrow, perhaps 1/4 of an inch, created by years of the wood drying and shrinking in the heat of the stove. He could see the lighter wedged down there, just out of reach of his fingertips. He tried to fish it out with a piece of kindling, but his hand slipped, and he pushed the lighter deeper. It clinked against something hard below. Jack sat back on his heels, frustrated. That lighter was the only tangible thing he had connecting his service to Silas's service. He couldn't leave it there. He remembered the lawyer's voice. "If you pry up one nail, the inheritance is void." Jack looked at the floorboard. It was a short piece, maybe 2 feet long. The nail head holding it down was rusted and loose, likely loosened further by the impact on the roof moments ago. "I'm not renovating," Jack reasoned aloud, looking at Gunnar for validation. "I'm retrieving personal property. That's different." Gunnar tilted his head, watching intently. Jack pulled his pocket knife from his belt. He jammed the flat blade into the seam. He hesitated. His heart was hammering against his ribs, louder than the wind outside. Was he really about to risk the only roof he had over his head for a lighter? But it wasn't about the lighter. It was about the truth. Jack knew, deep in his gut, that the lighter was just an excuse. He needed to see. He twisted the blade. With a groan of dry wood, the short plank popped up. The rusted nail gave way with a screech that sounded like a scream in the small room. Jack lifted the board and set it aside. He brought the kerosene lantern closer, lowering the flame toward the hole he had created in the floor. He expected to see dirt, maybe a crawl space, maybe insulation and rat nests. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. There was no dirt, there was no darkness. Reflecting the dancing flame of the lantern was a surface of dull, heavy yellow. It wasn't a pile of coins. It wasn't a scattered heap of nuggets. It was a solid, uniform bar, and it wasn't just one. As Jack shifted the light, he saw that the joists supporting the floor weren't timber joists at all. They were ingots, massive rectangular bars of metal, laid side by side, fitted with the precision of a stonemason. They were dull with age and oxidation, but the unmistakable luster of gold shone through where the wood had rubbed against them. Jack reached down. His hand wasn't shaking anymore. It was numb. He touched the metal. It was freezing cold, sucking the heat right out of his skin. He brushed a layer of dust away from the center of the bar. Stamped into the metal, deep and authoritative, were letters that looked like they belonged in a museum, not a shack in the Yukon. U.S. Mint, 1920, Reserve. Jack sat back, the air rushing out of his lungs in a whoosh. He felt dizzy. This wasn't just prospector gold. This wasn't dust shaken out of a pan. This was bullion. This was historic institutional wealth. Silas hadn't just found a vein. He had found a stockpile, or stolen it, or found someone else who had stolen it and died trying to move it. "The weight," Jack whispered, the realization crashing over him. "The whole house. It's not sitting on a foundation. It is the foundation." He looked around the room with wild eyes. If the floor was gold, what about the walls? Were the logs just hollowed out shells filled with more bars? Suddenly, the poverty of the last 10 years, the skipped meals, the cold nights in Detroit, the shame of not being able to buy Gunner the good dog food, felt like a cruel joke. He had been sleeping on top of enough wealth to buy a small country. But as he looked at the cold, hard metal, Jack didn't feel rich. He felt terrified. He saw a folded piece of oilskin paper tucked between the gold bars, right next to his dropped lighter. Silas must have wedged it there before nailing the floor down, a message in a bottle for the future. Jack retrieved the lighter and the paper. He unfolded the oilskin with trembling fingers. The note was short, written in pencil that had not faded. Jack, if you are reading this, you broke the rule. You stubborn son of a gun. You're wondering where it came from. Don't ask. The past is dead. You're thinking about Ferraris and mansions. Don't. That money is blood. I couldn't spend it. I was too afraid. But you were always braver than me. Use it for the boys who came home broken. Use it for the dogs who served and got left behind. Don't let this gold stay cold forever. And Uncle Si. Jack read the note twice, then a third time. The wind howled outside, battering the door, trying to tear the roof off. But Jack didn't hear it anymore. He looked at Gunner. The dog had moved closer and rested his chin on Jack's knee, looking down at the hole in the floor with curiosity. He didn't leave us a fortune, Gunner, Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. He left us a job. Jack carefully placed the wooden board back over the hole. He hammered the rusted nail back in with the heel of his boot until it sat flush. He wasn't a poor man anymore, but he wasn't a rich man either. He was a soldier who had just been given his final orders. Jack stood up and walked to the window. The storm was raging, turning the world into a white void. Somewhere out there, in the dark, Thorne was waiting. Thorne wanted the land. He wanted the rotting shack. If Thorne knew what was under these floorboards, he would burn the forest down to get it. Jack's reflection stared back at him from the dark glass. He didn't look like a tired old man anymore. He looked dangerous. Let it snow, Jack whispered to the storm. We're not going anywhere. He returned to his chair, placed the loaded pistol he had kept from his service days on the table next to the lantern, and poured himself the last of the coffee. It was cold, but he drank it anyway. He had a long night ahead of him. Jack sat in the dim light of the kerosene lantern, the silence of the cabin amplifying the beating of his own heart. The floorboard was nailed back down. The rug was pulled back over the spot. To the naked eye, the cabin was exactly as it had been an hour ago. A drafty, rough-hewn shelter in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. But to Jack, the room had changed. The air felt heavier. The walls felt tighter. He wasn't sitting in a shack anymore. He was sitting inside a vault. He looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had worked hard for every dime he ever made. They were scarred from the assembly line, calloused from the shovel, and weathered by years of worry about bills that never seemed to end. And now beneath the soles of his worn-out work boots lay enough wealth to buy the entire factory where he used to work. It doesn't make sense, Gunner, Jack whispered into the gloom. Gunner, sensing the shift in the room's energy, lifted his head from his paws. The dog let out a soft, questioning whine. Why us, Jack asked. Why leave it to two broken-down old soldiers? Jack picked up Uncle Silas's note again. The oilskin paper crinkled in his grip. Use it for the boys who came home broken. Jack closed his eyes and let his head rest against the back of the wooden chair. Memories he had kept locked away for decades began to surface. He remembered the humidity of the jungle, the smell of diesel and damp earth, the faces of friends who were 18 years old forever. He remembered coming home to a country that didn't know how to look him in the eye. He remembered the long nights at the VA hospital, sitting in plastic chairs, waiting for appointments that kept getting canceled. He thought of the K-9 handlers he had known, men who had to leave their four-legged partners behind in war zones because of red tape, or men who brought their dogs home only to watch them suffer from the same nightmares that plagued the humans. Silas was right. The gold wasn't a lottery ticket. It was a trust fund for a mission that the government had forgotten. It's not our money, Gunner, Jack said firmly, opening his eyes. The realization settled over him like a blanket. We're just the guards. This shift in perspective changed everything. If the gold was just loot, Jack might have been tempted to run. He might have packed the truck and fled before Thorne returned. But if the gold was a mission, if it was the only hope for men and dogs who had no one else, then Jack Sullivan wasn't going anywhere. He stood up, his knees popping in the cold air. The shock was fading, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He had a job to do. Inspection time, Jack muttered. He moved through the cabin with the methodical efficiency of a drill sergeant. He wasn't looking at the home as a place to sleep anymore. He was assessing it as a defensive position. He checked the front door. The oak was solid, inches thick, and the iron hinges were bolted deep into the frame. Silas had built this place to withstand grizzly bears and avalanches. It would hold against a few greedy men from the city. He moved to the windows. This was the weak point. Glass breaks. He went to the woodpile in the corner and found several flat planks of birch. "Sorry about the view, Gunner," Jack said as he picked up the hammer. With steady, rhythmic strokes, Jack began to board up the lower halves of the windows. He didn't seal them completely. He needed lines of sight. But he created narrow embrasures, turning the cheerful cottage windows into defensive firing ports. Bang, bang, bang. The sound of the hammer echoed through the clearing. Outside, the storm was finally breaking. The wind had died down to a low moan, and the snow was falling straight down in heavy, silent sheets. Jack knew what the break in the weather meant. It meant the roads would be passable by morning. It meant the snowmobiles could run again. Thorn wouldn't wait. Greed is an impatient master. Thorn knew Jack was vulnerable. He knew the storm would have isolated them. He would come back, likely with muscle, to frighten the old man into signing the deed. Jack walked to his duffel bag. He reached to the bottom, past the rolled-up socks and the spare flannel shirt, and pulled out a heavy canvas wrap. He unrolled it on the table. Inside lay a Colt 1911 pistol. It was old, the Parkerized finish worn silver at the muzzle and the grip safety, but it was impeccably clean. Beside it lay 2 spare magazines. Jack checked the action. Clack, clack. Smooth as silk. He didn't want to use it. He was a man of peace now. He had seen enough violence to last 10 lifetimes. But he also knew that there are men in this world who only speak one language, and sometimes you have to be fluent in it to survive. "We don't shoot unless we have to," Jack told Gunner, who was watching the gun with intelligent interest. "We scare them off. We hold the line." Gunner stood up and shook himself, the metal tags on his collar jingling. He walked to the door and pressed his nose against the crack, sniffing deeply. Then he looked back at Jack and gave a low, "Woof." "I know," Jack said. "I feel it too." The isolation of the wilderness, which had felt peaceful just yesterday, now felt oppressive. They were miles from the nearest sheriff. No cell service. No neighbors. If anything happened out here, the snow would cover the evidence before spring. Jack sat back down at the table, placing the pistol within arm's reach. He poured the last of the cold coffee into his tin cup. He looked at the floor again. He imagined the grit of gold bars beneath the wood. Tons of it. Cold, hard, indifferent. It had driven Uncle Silas to madness and isolation. Silas had died alone, guarding a secret that he couldn't share. "I won't end up like you, Uncle Si," Jack promised the empty room. "I'm not going to hide on top of this. I'm going to use it." He formulated a plan. He wouldn't fight Thorn force on force. He was too old for a brawl, and he was outnumbered. He would use the terrain. He would use the house. He would use the psychology of fear. Thorn was a city man. He saw the wilderness as a playground. Jack would show him that the wilderness was a trap. Jack went to the kitchen cupboard and found a bottle of cooking oil and a box of heavy-duty trash bags. He went to the bucket of water near the stove. "Gunner, you're going to have to be loud tomorrow," Jack said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "I need you to sound like a pack of wolves. Can you do that?" Gunner thumped his tail. He didn't know what gold was. He didn't know what a deed was. He only knew that his pack leader was tense and that there was a threat coming from the outside. And for a Malinois, that was the only instruction needed. Jack blew out the kerosene lantern. Total darkness swallowed the room, save for the dying orange glow of the wood stove embers through the grate. Jack didn't sleep. He pulled the wooden chair to the corner of the room, away from the windows facing the door. He wrapped himself in his blanket, the pistol in his lap, Gunner at his feet. The silence of the gold beneath the floor seemed to hum, a low vibration that traveled up through the chair and into his spine. It was the hum of history waiting to be rewritten. Outside, the clouds parted. A sliver of moon illuminated the white expanse of the frozen lake. Far in the distance, miles away, the faint buzzing whine of a high-powered snowmobile engine cut through the crisp night air. It was faint, like a mosquito in a bedroom, but to Jack's trained ears it was unmistakable. "Here we go," Jack whispered. The siege of the Golden Fortress was about to begin. The sound of snowmobile engines grew from a distant whine to a deafening roar, shattering the pristine silence of the Alaskan night. Jack sat in the darkness of the cabin, his back straight, his breathing measured. He held the old Colt 1911 loosely in his right hand, resting on his thigh. He wasn't aiming it. He didn't need to. Not yet. Gunner sat beside him, a statue carved from muscle and fur. The dog's ears were swiveling like radar dishes, tracking the movement outside. He let out a low, vibrating growl that resonated in his chest, but he didn't bark. He was waiting for the command. Outside, headlights swept across the boarded-up windows, slicing through the cracks in the planks Jack had nailed up. The lights cut frantic, blinding arcs through the dust motes in the room before settling on the front door. The engines died. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with threat. "Sullivan!" The voice was Thorne's. It was loud, arrogant, and slurred with the kind of false courage that comes from a flask of whiskey and the presence of hired muscle. "I know you're in there, old man. Open up. We need to talk about the property lines." Jack didn't move. He didn't speak. He knew the first rule of defensive warfare. Never give the enemy your position. "He's probably asleep," a second voice grumbled. Deeper, rougher, the hired muscle. "Or frozen to death. Let's just kick the door and get warm." "Do it," Thorne snapped. Jack heard the crunch of heavy boots on the snow. He heard them step onto the wooden porch stairs. Step, step, slip. "Whoa!" There was a frantic scrabbling sound, followed by a heavy, wet thud and a string of creative curses. Jack permitted himself a very small, grim smile in the darkness. An hour ago, Jack had boiled 3 pots of water on the wood stove. He had mixed in the bottle of cooking oil he found in the cupboard. Then he had opened the door and quietly coated the porch steps and the landing in front of the door. In 30 below temperatures, the mixture had frozen instantly into a sheet of black ice, slicker than glass and invisible in the dark. "Watch your footing, you idiot," Thorne hissed. "It's like a skating rink out here," the big man complained, groaning as he pulled himself up. "Just break the lock," Thorne ordered. Jack leaned forward. "Gunner," he whispered. "Ready?" The dog's muscles coiled. The doorknob rattled violently. Then a heavy boot slammed against the oak. Boom! The door shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling joists. But Silas Sullivan hadn't built a vacation home. He had built a vault. The iron hinges held fast. The heavy deadbolt didn't even budge. Boom! Another kick. "It's not opening!" the big man yelled. "Use the crowbar, you moron!" Thorne screamed. Jack heard the screech of metal biting into wood. They were attacking the frame now. Jack stood up. It was time. He walked quietly to the door, staying to the side of the frame. He reached out and with a sudden, fluid motion, threw the deadbolt back and yanked the door wide open. The hired muscle, who had been leaning his full weight into the crowbar, suddenly found himself pushing against nothing. He stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him straight across the threshold. He fell face first onto the cabin floor, right onto the spot where the gold bars lay hidden beneath the wood. Before he could scramble up, a shape exploded from the shadows. Gunner didn't bite. He didn't need to. He landed with his front paws squarely on the man's chest, pinning him to the floor. He lowered his face inches from the intruder's nose and let out a roar, a bark so loud and ferocious it shook the window panes. The man froze, his eyes wide with primal terror. He was looking up into the jaws of a 70-pound Belgian Malinois who looked ready to eat him alive. "Don't move," Jack said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos like a knife. He stepped into the light of the porch, the 1911 held low at his side. Thorne was standing on the porch clutching a flashlight, looking stunned. He stared at his hired thug pinned to the floor, then at the old man who looked far less frail than he had yesterday. "You," Thorne stammered. "You set a trap." "I opened my front door," Jack said calmly. "You fell in." "Call off the dog," Thorne yelled, reaching into his jacket pocket. Jack raised the pistol. He didn't point it at Thorne's head. He pointed it at Thorne's center of mass. His hand was rock steady. "Keep your hand where I can see it, Mr. Thorne," Jack said. "This is a customized 1911. It has a hair trigger, and I haven't had my morning coffee yet." Thorne froze. He slowly pulled his hand out of his pocket, empty. "You're making a mistake, Sullivan," Thorne sneered, trying to regain his composure. "We're just here to negotiate. You assaulted my associate." "You're trespassing," Jack corrected, "in the middle of the night, with a crowbar." "This land is worthless," Thorne spat. "Why are you fighting for it? Take the money and die somewhere warm." "It's not about the money," Jack said. "It's about the principle. Something you wouldn't understand." Thorne's eyes darted around. He was calculating. He realized Jack was just one old man. Thorne took a step forward, testing the waters. You won't shoot, Thorne scoffed. You're just a tired old vet. You don't have the guts. Jack didn't flinch. I promised my wife I'd never point a gun at a man again. Don't make me break a promise to an angel for a devil like you. The tension stretched thin, vibrating in the frozen air. Gunner was still growling low in his throat, holding the big man on the floor hostage. Thorne was inching forward. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger guard. Suddenly, the cabin was flooded with blue and red light. Whoop whoop! A siren chirped from the edge of the clearing, followed by the blinding spotlight of a police cruiser rolling out from behind the tree line. Thorne spun around, blinding himself in the glare. Sheriff's Department, a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. Drop the crowbar, hands in the air. Jack didn't look surprised. He simply engaged the safety on his pistol and lowered the weapon. Gunner, Jack said softly. Off. The dog immediately stepped back from the terrified thug, trotting to Jack's side and sitting down, instantly transforming from a wolf back into a disciplined partner. Sheriff Miller, a man nearly as wide as the doorframe, stepped out of his cruiser. He was wearing a heavy parka and a look of extreme annoyance. He walked up the slippery steps with crampons on his boots, ignoring the ice trap. Evening, Jack, Miller said, nodding to him like they were meeting at a diner. Sorry it took me a while. The roads are hell. Good to see you, Jim, Jack nodded. Coffee's cold, I'm afraid. Thorne looked between them, his face turning purple. You called the police. CB radio, Jack said, gesturing to a dusty unit in the corner of the room that Thorne hadn't noticed. Old school, still works fine. Miller slapped handcuffs on Thorne. Elias Thorne, we've had reports about you harassing folks in 3 counties. Trespassing, attempted breaking and entering, and I see you brought your crowbar. That upgrades it to burglary tools. This is a misunderstanding, Thorne shrieked as Miller dragged him toward the cruiser. I was just trying to buy the house. That old man is crazy. He might be crazy, Miller said, shoving Thorne into the back seat. But he's a decorated Marine, and he pays his property taxes early. That makes him a model citizen in my book. Jack stood on the porch and watched as the deputies loaded the hired muscle into the second car. The threat was leaving. The noise was fading. Sheriff Miller walked back up to the porch. He looked at the boarded-up windows, then at Jack. You okay, Jack? I'm fine, Jim. Miller looked down at the floorboards where the thug had fallen. He stomped his boot on the wood. It made that same dull, heavy thud. Sturdy house Silas built, Miller noted, eyeing Jack carefully. Awful heavy. Jack met the sheriff's eyes. He knew Miller suspected something. In a small town, everyone suspects something. But in Alaska, you respect privacy more than you love gossip. It holds the heat well, Jack said simply. Miller smiled, a slow, knowing smile. He tipped his hat. Well, keep it locked up, Jack. There's wolves out here. I know, Jack said, resting his hand on Gunner's head. But I've got the best wolf in the valley right here. As the taillights of the police cruisers disappeared into the tree line, leaving the clearing in darkness once more, Jack let out a long, shuddering breath. He walked back inside and closed the heavy oak door. He slid the bolt home. The siege was over. They had held the line. Jack walked to the center of the room. He knelt down and pressed his hand against the floorboards one last time. The cold from the gold seeped up, but it didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt secure. We did it, Uncle Si, Jack whispered. We kept it safe. Gunner walked over and licked Jack's face. Jack smiled, the first genuine smile in months, and buried his face in the dog's fur. Come on, buddy, Jack whispered. Let's get some sleep. Tomorrow we have work to do. Spring in the Alaskan interior doesn't tiptoe in. It explodes. One day the world is locked in a monochrome prison of white and gray. The next the sun stays out until midnight. The ice on the lake cracks with the sound of thunder, and the meadows are suddenly ablaze with the purple riot of fireweed. Jack Sullivan stood on the porch of the cabin, a mug of hot coffee in his hand. He wasn't shivering anymore. The air smelled of pine resin, damp earth, and the wild, sweet scent of melting snow. He looked different than the man who had arrived here in that rattling Ford truck a year ago. The hollowness in his cheeks was gone, replaced by a healthy tan from working outdoors. His shoulders, once hunched under the weight of poverty and loneliness, were square and strong. He wore a clean flannel shirt tucked into sturdy work pants, and his boots, though still worn, were laced tight. Gunner, fetch! Jack tossed a tennis ball toward the lake. Gunner didn't run alone. 3 other dogs thundered after the ball, a three-legged German shepherd named Duke, a skittish Labrador named Scout, and a young goofy golden retriever mix named Buster. They were a motley crew of scars and wagging tails, but they moved as a pack. Gunnar, despite his gray muzzle and stiff hips, reached the ball first. He didn't bring it back to Jack immediately. He paused, letting the three-legged shepherd catch up and steal it. It was a deliberate act of kindness from an alpha who knew his job wasn't to compete, but to teach. Jack smiled. Good boy. He turned back to the house. It had changed, too. The rotting shack that Thorn had sneered at was gone. In its place stood a sturdy, dignified cabin. The logs had been re-chinked and sealed. The roof had new shingles. A wide wraparound deck had been added, complete with wheelchair ramps. But the most important change was the sign hanging over the main archway of the driveway. It was a slab of polished cedar, carved with deep, gold leaf letters. The Silas Sullivan K9 Sanctuary. Rest, recover, rediscover. Jack walked inside. The heavy iron door was propped open to let the breeze in. The interior was transformed. The single, lonely room had been expanded. There were comfortable leather armchairs arranged around the wood stove. There were bookshelves filled with paperbacks. And the floor? Jack walked across the room. His boots made a solid, reassuring sound on the new hardwood surface he had installed over the original subfloor. He hadn't dug up the gold. He hadn't ripped the house apart to cash in his chips. After the arrest of Thorn, Jack had made a decision. He had carefully extracted exactly 2 of the gold bars from a corner of the room. Just 2. He had driven them to a reputable dealer in Seattle, a terrifying journey with a loaded shotgun on the passenger seat. The appraisal had nearly given him a heart attack. Those 2 bars alone, stamped with the 1920 U.S. Mint seal, were worth more than Jack had earned in his entire life. 2 bars were enough. Enough to fix the roof, enough to install a modern solar power system, enough to stock the pantry for 10 years, and enough to register the land as a nonprofit trust, protected forever from developers like Thorn. The rest of the gold, millions upon millions of dollars, stayed exactly where Uncle Silas had put it, right there beneath the floorboards. Jack walked over it every day. He swept it. He vacuumed it. To anyone else, it was just a floor. To Jack, it was the literal foundation of his new life. It was a secret he kept not out of greed, but out of respect. The gold wasn't currency anymore. It was ballast. It kept the ship steady. Mr. Sullivan, a voice called from the porch. Jack turned. Standing in the doorway was a young man, maybe 25. He was leaning heavily on a cane, his left pant leg pinned up where his calf used to be. Beside him stood a nervous-looking Belgian Malinois wearing a service vest. Please call me Jack, he said, walking over with his hand extended. I'm Corporal Martinez, the young man said, gripping Jack's hand. The VA rep said you might have space for King. He hasn't been doing well since we got back. Loud noises scare him. He won't eat. Jack looked at the dog, King. The animal was shaking, eyes darting around the room, looking for threats. I understand, Jack said softly. He knelt down, ignoring the creak in his own knees. He didn't look the dog in the eye. He just offered a calm, non-threatening presence. Take off the vest, Corporal, Jack suggested. He's not on duty here. Neither are you. Martinez hesitated, then unclipped the heavy tactical vest. King shook himself, a cloud of dust flying off his coat. Gunnar trotted in from the deck. He didn't bark. He walked straight up to the nervous new dog, sniffed his ear, and gave a low, rumbling groan that sounded like a greeting. Welcome to the pack, kid. King stopped shaking. He leaned against Gunnar, drawing strength from the older dog's confidence. How much is the boarding fee? Martinez asked, reaching for his wallet. I don't have much until my disability check clears, but Jack stopped him with a gentle hand on his shoulder. Put your money away, son, Jack said. Your bill was paid a long time ago. Paid by who? Jack looked down at the floorboards. He thought of Uncle Silas, broken and alone, pouring his life into this metal so that someone, someday, could find peace. By the man who built this house, Jack said. He wanted to make sure you had a warm place to land. Jack led Martinez to one of the armchairs by the window. Sit down. Coffee's fresh. The view is free. Stay as long as you need. Later that evening, the sun began to dip behind the granite peaks, painting the sky in shades of violet and fire. The house was quiet. Martinez was asleep in the guest room, King snoring softly on the rug beside him. Jack sat in his rocking chair on the porch. Gunnar lay at his feet, his head resting on Jack's boot. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out the old iron key, the heavy one that had started it all. He didn't need it to lock the door anymore. The real security of this place wasn't the locks. It was the community he was building. He looked out over the lake. He thought about Detroit. He thought about the cold, hungry nights. It felt like a different lifetime. "We did okay, didn't we, Gunner?" Jack whispered. Gunner looked up, his amber eyes filled with that bottomless, unconditional love. He thumped his tail once. Jack took a sip of his coffee. He felt the warmth of the mug, the warmth of the dog, and the warmth of the floor beneath his chair. A floor held up by the heaviest burden in the world, transformed into the lightest gift. Uncle Silas had called it the weight, but as Jack watched the eagles circle the thermal currents above the valley, he realized Silas had been wrong. It wasn't a weight, it was an anchor. And for the first time in his life, Jack Sullivan wasn't drifting. He was home. The end. Author's note to the audience. Thank you so much for following Jack and Gunner's journey through the snow and into the spring. It has been a privilege to share this story of resilience, loyalty, and the hidden treasures we find when we stop running and start building. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you discovered a life-changing secret beneath your floorboards like Jack did, would you use it to buy a life of luxury, or would you build a sanctuary for others? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, walk lightly and keep your loved ones close.